So I'm Annabelle Stockwin. For those who don't know, I'm head of shellfish policy for the non-quota species team in Defra. I'm joined today by Helen Hunter and Adam Carroll on the shellfish side, and also from Defra we have Della Stein, head of NQS implementation team, and Phil McBride, head of finfish policy for the NQS team. We're also supported today by Sarah Errington from the MMO and Lewis Tattersall from Seafish. So Helen, Adam and myself will be presenting today. We do have a few slides to run through, but don't be alarmed. This will be relatively short and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So a little bit of housekeeping. We will be recording the presentation, but we'll turn off the recording for questions. We have got until 5. We might not need all that time, but let's see how it goes. And I also realise I forgot to mention Joanna Massini, who is also here today from Defra. Sorry, forgot you there, Joanna. Okay, so that's everyone. I'm not sure, I can't see everybody, but I can see quite a few of you, which is lovely, thank you. The purpose of the session today then is to share some of the work that Defra and MMO are doing at the moment to develop the FMP measures for implementation. We want to improve awareness of the checks that we must take against proposals to ensure they meet legal and policy requirements, and we will be explaining the stages involved and the time that this can take. So the purpose for introducing this session, we thought it would be helpful to improve overall awareness of the work that's carried out on each measure in order to make sure it does meet legal and policy requirements. We'll explain some of the wider considerations that we have to take account of and talk about all the different stages that we go through before a measure can be introduced. I know some of this will be familiar to a number of you, but we thought this would be a good opportunity to share everything with a wider audience as possible on all the work we're doing at the moment and why. So this afternoon we will cover the different pieces of legislation and policies we take account of, explain some of the ways that we do this and walk you through a practical example. I did just want to say before we move on that this is all standard practice, part of what government's due diligence role is, but FMPs are new, so there is an element of us needing to take a bit of time to get all of this right. Thanks, Adam. Next slide. So a little bit of scene setting. As many of you will be aware, FMPs are part of a huge programme of work. Alongside the due diligence requirements, we're also working within the wider FMP framework, which is led by the FMP programme team. For NQS, we've got 2 teams, our teams on the shellfish side and Phil's finfish team, and we're collectively responsible for 11 FMPs across all 4 tranches. So this means we're working on delivering T1 and 2, consulting on T3, and drafting and engaging on the T4s. As each stage requires a level of due diligence and assessing the impacts and testing, etc., that we're going to go through, it's useful to consider this in the round with all stages of FMPs and development. So we seek legal views at different stages across the life cycle of an FMP, and we're going to talk through some of these particular requirements in the following slides. I should also note that aside from all of that, we also bring in other teams from across Defra to get their expertise and input. And there's a whole R&D evidence programme supporting the FMPs. So while this looks like a lot of things to consider for each measure, it does in the end result in better management, we believe, in the long run. And the more time we take to get this right now, the idea is the smoother the final delivery will be. And also it's our job and we enjoy it. Next slide, Adam, thank you. So that leads me on to roles and responsibilities. Starting with Defra, we have to balance all considerations and make recommendations to ministers. So that's what we do in a very short sentence. Detail on what all this means in practice is really going to be the subject to the rest of this presentation. But a balance of considerations must include all impacts: economic, environmental, social and sustainable. the MMO, lead the management of fisheries. They also have to balance all the above considerations and test measures against relevant policy and legislation, with a particular focus on considering the compliance and enforcement aspect of any new measure. The IFCAs, of course, manage within the 0 to 6, crucial to the regulatory landscape we work in. And we have CFAS, lead on the fisheries science, have a specific FMP programme of research and evidence, which they need to deliver, which I mentioned earlier. And stakeholders, of course, completely crucial to informing this management, providing evidence, and to collaborate with all of us and support delivery. I am handing over now to Adam, who's going to talk you through some of the domestic legislative framework and how we apply that. So thank you very much. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Annabelle. So on the domestic side, the main part is obviously when the UK became a newly independent coastal state, we introduced the Fisheries Act, and then the Act gives us these 8 overarching objectives, and then required the UK's fisheries authorities to produce the JFS, the Joint Fisheries Statement, in 2022. So the JFS confirmed the use of fisheries management plans to manage stock sustainably in a flexible manner with input from the industry and other partners, and lists all the FMPs that are to be developed through to 2028. So policies within our FMPs are legal commitments, and the Fisheries Act obliges the fisheries authorities to implement them in a way that's consistent with all the measures of the Fisheries Act and of the FMPs. So the FMPs are subject to a statutory review, a maximum of 6 years after their publication. And within that, it will be necessary for us to clearly evidence what's been achieved through the FMPs in the implementation of their actions and measures, and how the FMP has performed against delivering to the Fisheries Act objectives. So when we're developing and introducing management measures or interventions, we have to take time to ensure measures are satisfying the requirements of the FMPs and the Fisheries Act and various intersections with other domestic legislation. A selection of those pieces of legislation are on the slide, such as the Marine Strategy, the GES, Good Environmental Status, or the Environment Act. But this is by no means an exhaustive list. There's lots of sort of cross-cutting bits of government legislation regulations that we have to ensure that we're acting in compliance with and that we're aligned with, and we have to demonstrate progress against those statutory obligations. And then sort of in parallel with that, we do have the bilateral framework of the TCA, the deal that we agreed with the EU. So after leaving the EU, we signed the TCA, and we need to be confident that any measures we put in are compliant with the TCA, or we risk legal challenge through the dispute mechanism. And if there's a dispute and it's successful, that's going to incur a big loss of financial resources and time. It's going to cause delays, and ultimately it's going to undermine our attempts to deliver on the FMPs and the Fisheries Act objectives. We're not going to make any progress towards introducing sustainable management if every time we bring something in, it's risking getting challenged and then slowed down. So under the TCA, ultimately the UK retains its regulatory autonomy, so we're able to set our own laws and regulations and management decisions, which the EU vessels have to abide by. But when we implement them, we have to ensure that they're justified in pursuit of agreed objectives and that they're given consideration of key principles. So the objectives include looking towards the long-term sustainability of the stocks, the socio-economic benefits of the fisheries themselves, and the mutual objective of maintaining or restoring populations to MSY biomass levels or an estimate of. So additionally, we have to take consideration of various principles when designing measures. These include the proportionality principle and the non-discrimination principle, so ensuring that measures are proportionate and impact both fleets equally. How we apply the precautionary approach in the absence of evidence, and whether we're basing management decisions on the best available scientific evidence. And then there's several others, such as ensuring that we're taking sufficient action to protect juvenile specimens and reduce unwanted bycatch. And we're taking account of and minimizing harmful impacts on the marine ecosystem. So therefore, during development of FMP measures, we need to be certain that these measures are aligned with the objectives set out in the TCA and that appropriate consideration has been given to these principles, and that we've taken evidence and shown that we have done that in case we're challenged on it down the line. So the more detailed the evidence of our considerations are that we take, the easier it will be to demonstrate how the objectives and principles have been considered, and it will reduce the risk of a TCA dispute disrupting implementation. So overall, much of what we're required to take into consideration of under the TCA, we'd already be considering in regard to domestic legislation I mentioned on the previous slide. So it in and of itself isn't adding a huge obstacle. So when we're testing policies against regulations, there are various questions we'll consider, such as how the measure affects vessels and gear types, in terms of proportionality, whether the scale of intervention is proportionate to the issue that the measures aim to address, whether we're using the best available scientific evidence, and when we're not faced with complete evidence, as is typically the case with non-quota species, how we're approaching applying the precautionary principle, and what's the rationale behind acting within the precautionary approach in those cases. We also have to look towards the long-term sustainability goals in terms of how the proposal aligns with longer-term objectives around socioeconomic and environmental sustainability of fishing stocks, and the ecosystem and marine biological diversity in terms of what impact it will have on the ecosystem, and whether the effects have been accounted for and negative effects have been minimized. So I'm now going to hand over to Helen to talk a bit more through the steps we go through when developing measures. Thanks.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Adam. Hi to those of you who don't know me, Helen Hunter from the Shellfish team. So I thought I'll introduce a bit of a picture, bit of a colour, always like a visual, just to, as Adam says, just a bit of a sort of step back. So a bit less specific to start with on the steps that we in government have to follow when we're developing policy or measures. So I'll run through it at sort of this level, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail. But as you'll probably notice, it's not rocket science, to be honest. And these points, which, as I say, I'll run through in a second, they're not only applied to when you're developing sort of policy, you can apply them, as I say, to when you're developing fishery measures or any kind of issue or topic that you're dealing with in life in general. As I say, it's not rocket science. They're fairly basic principles, but there's a fair bit that sits underneath them. So if we just nip to the next slide, Adam, I'll go into some of this in a little bit more detail. Don't worry, I won't spend too long on these things because it will become pretty obvious as we go through it. But the first step, define the issue. So obviously, what is it that we're trying to address? Is there a problem that we're trying to solve? What is that? What's causing it? And what do we actually want to achieve in actually trying to tackle this? So that's where you start, defining the problem, defining the issue. And then you move on to understanding the wider context of that issue. So, for example, the things we have to consider is, can this issue only be solved through a direct government intervention? Are there any other options? Can we work through others to deliver the same outcome? Are there any external factors outside of the direct issue that could affect delivery of what we're trying to do? So if there's a problem and we're trying to solve it, are there other factors, for example, economic, political, social, whatever they might be, that might impact on what we want to do? And are there other policies or measures either being developed at the same time or that already exist that could impact what we're trying to do, and vice versa? So it's keeping an eye on what's going on outside of that direct kind of issue. We then move on to developing the option, or the options and the measures. So again, under this, it's quite straightforward, quite obvious, but we need to, be clear that we are looking at a range of options as far as possible. We need to be happy that we've explored the most radical, creative ideas available, including doing nothing. You may get to this point and actually decide that we don't need a direct government intervention, or actually nothing needs to happen, which could relate back to the wider context. We also need to look at what's been done before. So is there evidence available, or data or information available, or lessons that we can learn from other policy areas, or measures that have already been tried and tested and that are working well or not? We also need to consider early on as well, who do we need to talk to in developing these options? So obviously there are stakeholders, Annabelle mentioned earlier, crucial part of this development process, but we also have experts. So we have academia, obviously industry fall within that as well, other government departments, delivery bodies. So we need to be sort of clear on that up front. We then move on to the understanding the benefits and impact stage. So it's asking questions such as what would look different if the measure, for example, we're trying to develop is functioning properly and is doing what it was supposed to do. How would it feel for those actually being directly affected by the measures? What kind of impact is it going to be if we indeed achieve the outcomes that we set out to do when we first introduced the measure? And we also need to think about what are the potential barriers to achieving these outcomes. Don't always know what they are, but some of them are obvious. And again, it's keeping an eye on those as well. And we also need to have a fair understanding at this point around how can these ideas or solutions be delivered? Are they actually deliverable? Are they able to be complied with? Do we have an understanding of the costs and the risks and the trade-offs, et cetera, et cetera? So once you've done all that, it gets to the bit that Adam and others mentioned around sort of testing this against government commitments. So again, this applies to policy, but you can directly apply it to fisheries management measures. So we need to look at, does this measure or does this approach fit with the government's agenda to reduce the role of government and deregulation? So do we want to be bringing in, as I said, a direct government intervention, or is there a better and another way to do it? What are the other options, and are we working with the right people to get there? We also need to clearly articulate how these measures or proposed measures or plans or policies conform and contribute to existing commitments. So as Adam's run through, we have Fisheries Act commitments. We need to test them against that. We have the Joint Fisheries Statement. We have the commitments in the FMP. We have the obligations under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. We have environmental indicators and environmental assessments. So that all needs to be tested. And it's not always at one precise point in the process. We have to have due diligence to this all the way through. But then there will come a point where we do have to say, right, let's not develop this any further. Let's test this through these various kind of lenses, as they say. We also need to be clear and describe how we're going to measure success. So how are we going to know what we're trying to do is actually not only achievable, but effective. So we need to set out plans on how we're going to do that. So how are we actually going to know whether or not the measure that we're bringing in has achieved what we set out for it to achieve? Has it achieved its aims? Do we know if it's delivering value for money? We need to set out how we're going to be clear about that. So, for example, it could be the world's greatest measure, but it could be the world's most expensive measure to introduce. So we need to test it through the value for money lens. And we need to be clear about how we're going to test whether we think this is actually the option or the measure that will make the biggest difference. How are we going to know that? How could we maybe look to improve it? And we need to be clear about how flexible the policy or the measure or whatever it is the plan may be to responding to changes, which is obviously highly relevant to fisheries. So we need to be clear before we introduce anything, how are we going to measure that and how are we going to monitor it? And then when we've done all of that, there's more to it, but this is kind of a bit of a snapshot, comes the propose the solution or solutions and show your workings, which is a key bit of this. So this includes asking ourselves questions and making sure we're clear, we've clearly set out that the policy or the measure or what we're proposing is based on the best available scientific evidence, data analysis, depending obviously on the nature of the measure. We need to set out clearly and be confident that we've worked with and consulted the right people in the right way. And that includes obviously, have we brought in specialists, for example, at the right times? Are we basing this on the best available quality advice? We also need to be happy that we've exhausted as many sources of information as possible. So have we sort of delved into the archives, as it were? Have we looked back to see how people tackled this problem last time and how it panned out? Do we already have data rather than starting from scratch? So we need to be clear on that. We also need to think about the future. And actually, as well as looking at how are we going to monitor whether or not we've achieved our aims, we need to understand how this measure or this policy is going to impact those affected, including stocks. And as I think Annabelle mentioned, we also need to have some clear economic information. We need to have the social impacts, environmental impacts. We need to be very clear on all of that. And we need to, sort of set out the pros and cons of the different options. As Annabelle mentioned, our role is to put recommendations to ministers. We rarely just put one recommendation. It's usually a suite, if we can, with, pros and cons for each one. What's the strongest? What would you recommend and why? So we need to be really clear on that. So as I say, showing your workings, really, really important. It's a bit like a maths exam is how I think of it. You get a better grade if you show how you got to the answer, even if the answer is wrong. So that's a really quick canter through the process. I think if we move on to the next one, Adam, and fear not, I will stop talking in a moment. But I thought what I'd try and do, bear with me on this, is apply those steps very, very quickly to an actual real example of a fishery management measure that we are bringing in at the moment. So I picked the increased lobster minimum landing size. There were many to choose from. I just picked this one because this is the one that I found the easiest to fit under the different headings. But obviously we need to apply this to all of them. So really quickly, just to try and make this a bit more real. So defining the issue. So obviously the issue that led to us deciding to increase the lobster MLS is risk of increased fishing pressure on age and size structure of lobster stocks, which can impact the reproductive capability and the ability of the stock to recover when it's fished. So that was kind of the issue. The next stage, understanding the wider context of that. Obviously, we need to look at, we wouldn't just do this in isolation. We need to look at, has this been a problem in other areas? How was that? What was the solution to that? What was applied? So, for example, in some IFCA regions, they have a higher lobster minimum landing size. So we looked at where that is. Has that worked? How can you measure success, etc.? And are there any external factors that could impact this or influence this? So, for example, markets. If we increased it, obviously big sized lobsters are going to be landed. So that was getting a better idea of the wider context. We then set about developing the options and the measures. So obviously, one option is increase the lobster MLS to 90 millimeters as per the FMP. But as part of that sort of testing and looking at making sure we're looking at a range, is we looked at size options, which areas should this be focused on or should be implemented? How should it be introduced? Should it be a phased approach or go straight in for the higher one? So that was all the work done developing the different options and the sort of the different way that we could approach bringing it in. And then, of course, throughout that, we need to understand the benefits and the impacts. So obviously the estimated stock benefits, which is tricky, but we need to use the best available evidence we have. Economic impacts, benefits of harmonising with the IFCAs, for example. So that was all sort of done in the round under that heading. We move swiftly on, Adam. Lovely. Then comes the testing against the government commitments. So obviously we need to estimate, as far as we can, the environmental impacts of the measure, how it aligns with the Fisheries Act objectives. So, for example, the sustainability objective. How does this align with what we've committed to in the FMP? How does it align with our obligations under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, for example? So we had to go through all of that, as we always do. That's just a little snippet. There are other things that we had to consider. And then in terms of describing success, we had to think about how could we actually monitor this? So in terms of stock status, is there anything we can specifically attribute to in terms of changing the stock status to this measure? Possibly not, but if not, we need to understand why. We need to understand the impacts of not only the increase, but how we introduce it on industry. So we need to be able to demonstrate that we're able to closely monitor what this is doing and that we are able to react quickly if needs be. And as I said before, that it's actually delivering value for money. So there's no point in bringing in a measure that no one can actually afford to comply with or enforce. And then finally, propose a solution, which is kind of the point we're at now. So we need to demonstrate, obviously, a clear evidence base, not only why we're doing this measure, but why we're doing it in the way we're proposing, who is involved in the development of it, the pros and cons of the different options that we've considered. And obviously, we need to ensure that it's legally compliant with everything I mentioned above, and then it will help go towards delivering government commitments, not only in the above mentioned sort of FMP and things like that, but the wider Defra and government commitments. So that's kind of the stage we're at the moment. So I think you'll be pleased to know that's probably the end of it for me, but hopefully, as I say, trying to sort of apply a real world example, that's just a little snippet, but hopefully it makes it a little bit more tangible as to how we would go through these steps. And it's worth just mentioning as well that we don't do this in that order. A lot of this, there's a lot of overlap. So we don't finish one and move to the next. We're constantly having to sort of think about these steps as we go and sort of switch to and from. But I think at this point, I'm handing back to Annabelle, who's going to talk about, as I mentioned, the very important bit of showing your workings. So over to you, Annabelle.
Thank you. I think we're, next slide. Thanks, Adam. Yes, I'll rattle through this because I didn't want the presentation to take up too much time, but I hope you're all enjoying it so far. We need to show workings and explain how we've developed policies and come to our conclusions. So this is a quick slide just to show how we perhaps would do this for the legal considerations, which, as you know, is only one part of the picture. So development of FMP policies, actions and measures. We will record information on impacts to provide to lawyers alongside the draft FMP. We obtain the legal views on how the proposed measures comply with legal requirements at the initial development stage, pre-consultation and then pre-publication. Ensure views are reflected in the FMP drafts at each stage and the right references are made to policies and legislation are included. And then we'll undertake final compliance review prior to implementation to ensure that all management measures proposed comply with the relevant legislation. So the legislative framework we work in is often deliberately sort of loosely defined. You'll find that there's language like need to consider or need to take account of. This wording is used in quite a lot of our legislation, and it's designed to ensure, obviously, that action isn't taken without proper consideration of the impacts, but also allowing enough freedom to actually make decisions. So that's where Helen's maths analogy comes in again. It's no good saying you've considered X, Y, and Z. You need to actually do it and be able to demonstrate that you have. This makes for better measures overall. Each process of this due diligence takes us a bit closer to a more successful outcome, as Adam highlighted earlier in his slides. I think next slide is mine too, please, Adam. Thank you. So yeah, we're coming to the end now. This slide shows where and how you can get in touch and keep up to date with the FMPs. I did want to talk a little bit about the new groups that have been established to support the delivery. You'll see those mentioned there. So for implementation, for the tranche 1s and 2s, we have a number of new implementation groups that have been set up. This collaborative working with stakeholders was at the heart of the development of FMPs and must now continue to be at the heart of delivery. So the new group set up to support this delivery, and they will be taking the lead on delivering some of the actions that sit under the FMP objectives. Membership is quite wide. We have industry, MMO, IFCAs, Defra and ENGO representation on all of these groups. Most of them, I think, have met at least 3 times now since being established. And they're currently at the stage of developing work plans, which are actually going to deliver some of this stuff. So we can work together and the groups will be owning particular projects and actions that will deliver on some of these objectives. Sorry, some of you will know that, some of you be members of these groups, but I thought it's worth sharing so that a wider audience is aware of how we're trying to deliver as much of this as we can in the most collaborative way. So I think that brings us to the end of our presentation now. Thank you very much for listening. We will stop recording. The presentation will make that available